What's up, everyone? I am your host and co-founder of Pipeline, Snoopeh. This is the Becoming a Creator podcast. Today, I'm joined by Jatt Leesman. He is a staple in League of Legends for the last decade, and he has navigated so many career changes from being a pro player to being a caster to being a game designer to being a creator himself and then a head coach and then back to a caster. He's seen it all. I'm excited to dive into his journey today. Jatt, it is incredible. I don't know if what you go by as. I know you as Jatt. That's what I know you as.
Yeah, sure.
But it is
that works.
Great to have you on the podcast. We've had a bit of a past. We've crossed paths a number of times over the years. It's great to come full circle and have you on the show and talk about your journey.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you and me first met. We would have known of each other since at least 2011.
Yes, definitely.
But then we would have first met in person probably like sometime in 2012.
Well, when was WCG?
Oh, that was 2011.
That was 2011. Yeah, so it would have been 2011 then. Yeah.
Jeez.
Talk about a blast from the past on that.
That's actually over a decade ago. Wow, that's nuts.
It is. You back then you were competing professionally. You did a stint competing in League of Legends. How did you even get into that? Because I know that wasn't your first stint competing professionally. How did you even get into competing?
Oh, sure. Basically, like Pro League of Legends back then, like wasn't really what Pro League of Legends would be now, where you can just like do it and that be your living. So I mean, I wasn't really a pro gamer before, but I was really competitive in a game called Guild Wars. So probably from like 2008 to 2007 to 2010, I was really, really into Guild Wars. And I was working odd jobs, and I was also going to school for electronic engineering at the time. So yeah, I was like top player in Guild Wars, moved over to League with a bunch of the other people that played Guild Wars, which helped me like learn League faster. But then they kind of didn't get hooked on it the way that I did. And that's when I joined like Rock Solid and Dignitas, these random team names back then. I'm not sure exactly what the viewership of your podcast familiarity with Guild Wars and League is, so I won't get too into it. But that was kind of how I got into it.
Yeah, there's definitely a bit of crossover. There was some really bad League of Legends names back then. What was worse? Like, was there a team called Whale or something?
Oh yeah, that was the original team that I was on with a couple buddies from Guild Wars. It was like, but it like the acronym was Whale, but I think the name was Disciples of the Great Whale Lord King. It wasn't supposed to make sense. Like it was not, because it wasn't a team. Like we didn't have a logo. It's literally just a name you needed on a sign up form. That's all it was. So you just do stupid stuff.
We have came a long way since then. One of the things that has really fascinated me about your journey, how much you have reinvented yourself in a way on all these different kind of professional areas of the gaming industry. I think it's phenomenal what you've accomplished. And when I think about a lot of the creators that are listening today, and there's a little bit of crossover there, is the idea that the industry is constantly changing around you. What people want to watch is changing, what people's interest, the form that they want to watch in is changing constantly.
Yeah.
And you have to be able to adapt, and you have to be able to master the new craft. You can't just stay static. If you stay complacent over time, you're obviously going to fade out. And I look at your journey over the years, and you've made these conscious choices to move into a new area, and you've chosen to master, and not just like do it, because it is one thing to do the thing. You chose to become a master in that area. So back in the past, back in 2011, you were competing at the highest level in League of Legends. You made the decision then to transition out of that into casting. What kind of brought on that decision?
It was a little bit of a long journey because originally I joined Riot in 2012, like February of 2012, on the game like balance team as a QA analyst, because I had always had this like thing in the back of my head that I wanted to work on games, and specifically balance games, because I played them at such a high level and always like had all these strong opinions about balance. But what ended up happening was Dustin Beck joined Riot, and they were going to start up the LCS. So it changed from this like circuit system where maybe you could play in like 4 events a year and then maybe qualify for a world championship and never really have like a career in it, which is one of the reasons that I joined to like work as an employee because I couldn't make a living, at least in my head, I couldn't make a living as an esports pro. Because I was also at the time like 24, which was like 4 years older than most of the esports pros in the scene. So I just kind of looked around and said, like, I thought I was past that point in my life. But when they started the LCS, there was a need for commentators. And I had like definitely dabbled in it on a few online tournaments. And I had a pretty strong background in just being a huge sports fan. And at the time, there weren't that many people who knew League at a really high level who were also like huge sports fans. So I think it helped me port traditional sports broadcasting tendencies to League better than other people could. And I ended up having this like long conversation with a guy called Sean Bender, who was like the VP of people back at Riot back in 2012. Just going over like the pros and cons of like, what if you continued to pursue something in game design versus what if you jumped to League of Legends commentary. And the conclusion we kind of came away with was there are a lot of people that could be, and this is not like meant to be a knock on me or anything, but there's just so many people that can be good game designers. Like the pool that are into League and can create game design skills is really big, but the immediate need in League and your combination of current, like at the time, challenger. So it would be like I was still like a top 100 player on the server, while also having like good verbal skills and a sports background. Like I was one of one at the time instead of like one of 1,000. So go do the thing that you're one of one in, because you're probably going to be way more successful in that, and it'll end up being like more fulfilling. So that was the core of how I made that decision, and then I ended up doing that for about 7 straight years before I started jumping around a little bit more.
So that's yeah, I think seeing the evolution back then was phenomenal. How when there's all this kind of pressure going on around you, the League of Legends and esport was blowing up from 2012 onwards. And you know a lot more of the numbers than I do, but it was just blowing up continually over this kind of like 5-year stretch when you were in your casting career. There's a lot of external pressure that comes with that. Did you feel like you were prepared for that from when you were competing professionally, or do you feel like this was on another level?
A little bit of both, to be honest. I definitely would have reacted to things differently in League if I hadn't had the kind of experience and maybe maturity that I gained from Guild Wars. The community was much smaller, but I definitely did some like stupid stuff back in Guild Wars. I can try and tell you a story because you don't even know Guild Wars that well, so I should be able to like make it understandable. There was this every year they did this monthly tournament, and the format for it was a Swiss system. So if it's a system used in chess where it's a way of getting like a top 16 from a very large pool of teams, because there would be like 100 teams and you'd play 6 games and then they'd take the top 16 from that. So the way Swiss would work is if you get a random opponent in round 1, if you both win, you play the 1 and 0 opponent. If you both win, you play the 2 and 0 opponent, and so on and so forth. And then it'll do like a strength of schedule weighting based on like, hey, if your first opponent ended 6-0, that loss isn't as bad. If they ended 0-6, that win isn't as important. But we were going into the last round of Swiss, and we looked at the bracket, and we knew the team we were playing against was like a good team, like definitely a top 10 team, just like us. And we said, oh, if we tie, then we'll both be top 16. So why risk winning or losing? Except we made like this stupid game of it where instead of just like, I mean, either way, you're ladder manipulating. Like, you're basically cheating. And there's definitely situations in chess where, like, they will agree to draw, but that's more accepted. No one ever did this in Guild Wars. So, like, we just all got into a ventriloqual and just ran around in circles for 28
Wait,
minutes.
the other team was in on this?
Yeah. We agreed as both teams. Like, why don't we just not try and beat each other? But then we just ran around in circles for 28 minutes. And we ended up both making top 16. We ended up winning the tournament. So like our argument could be like, oh, we would have beaten them anyway. But at the same time, like we could have also just lost that game and then never even made top 16. But the problem with that is like the developers of the game got really, really pissed.
Can imagine.
Yeah. More pissed than the community, but the community was also very pissed. And at the time, like I just brushed it off because I was just like a kid and I didn't really care. So I was just like jumping into the forums and just like almost fanning the flames. Like, haha, you idiots! Like they do this.
Were you the captain
time.
of the team,
like,
of the Guild Wars team, or no?
No, but I was just like one of the known players because I played like frontline. The leaders of the team were different. That was like they're not going to watch this podcast. Owoa and 3 Pounds formed the team, but yeah, and it just like it was definitely a precursor to like almost what happened with Scumbag Jatt back in 2011. I've been through like a lot of controversies, it turns out. But what that kind of gave me is like, okay, it is actually a little bit important to understand what people think because you can't just kind of say whatever you want and have it not matter. We ended up like almost getting permaban from the game, but apparently like we didn't. They just took our like rewards away and then we're able to win them back the next month because we're a really good team. But that like I had that experience really early on. I had a Scumbag Jatt experience really early on where I think a lot of things were like just not perceived properly, but I definitely didn't engage as like boldly as I did before, which I think helped weather that storm a little bit. And then coming out of it, I was like tried to be very understanding of what both sides could be. So kind of my approach to controversy ended up becoming a lot more conservative than it would have otherwise been. And I think that ended up helping because as a caster, you're inevitably going to be in controversy because there's so many strong fans of individuals or teams, and you need to just make statements that are contradictory to that fandom sometimes. And it leads to that kind of blowback. And I don't know, I was more used to handling it because I'd been through a few up and downs and realizing that it can be level after like a month.
That resilience in the public limelight, I think, is really important for content creators as well, because inevitably they'll face it at every level that you kind of go through as a content creator. When you were going through it, like what is your kind of mental state? Have you got people around you that are helping you think through this? Or is it you're just, I need to take time myself? What is like when you go through these situations where I wouldn't say it's canceling. Maybe that was like an early version of canceling back then. It was just less risk, I guess.
Sure.
When that process is happening, like what is your emotional dialogue at that point?
It's I'm very internal with how much I think. I think about kind of everything. Rather, my mind is always away somewhere. Like it's sometimes hard for me to focus on the present because I'm just off spinning on something and figuring things out. When I get like pretty close, I definitely did have some people that I was able to talk through it with, whether they be online or whether like it was a manager at Riot, depending on the time. But having like one or two really good confidants that know your history and know how you've thought about things in the past, even just to bounce ideas off of, is really, really valuable. Otherwise, you can end up spinning forever. I would not recommend trying to take the advice online as something to immediately act on. It is something that I do think is still relatively important to just know generally what's happening. I don't think you need to read every single comment. That can actually be pretty detrimental. But to just get a gist of what's happening, I think is good. But yeah, the support system internally is like super important.
Do you feel like that's a muscle that you've built now over your career that you've gotten stronger and your ability to assess what you should listen to and not listen to has gotten better? Or do you feel like there's always a cause where something just comes so left field because it's the internet and it's so dynamic that you're surprised?
Yeah, I thought that I was getting better at it, but I actually kind of want to get your opinion on this too. Do you feel like it's changed a significant amount in the past 5 years? Because I would almost say that 5 years ago, it was a lot easier to block out if there was negativity on Twitter or Reddit. But I feel like now a lot of decision makers are also influenced by Twitter and Reddit, which makes it a lot harder to ignore. What are your thoughts on that?
I absolutely agree. I think it's now the flow of information is so pervasive on online platforms that to be good at your job, you have to be aware of what's happening around you. And a lot of those middle managers or upper management are now on these platforms, and they're probably not participating or commenting as much, but they're definitely using that as a cue. Yeah. And then I think generally the world has become quite polarizing, which has like people will take the far left side of an argument or the far right side of an argument, and there's no like middle ground. And I think that is causing a level of divisiveness and people participating when they don't really know the circumstances much, which makes it a much more polarizing environment than it may have been 5 years ago. In fact, it definitely is.
Yeah. So even for you, because it used to be less important to immediately correct something if there was a rumor or a speculation going on that would be negative about you online. I feel like that used to be less important. It's probably more important now, which makes it really tricky for me because it's not traditionally how I've tried to deal with things.
My belief is, and I think there's a prime example of this, like Joe Rogan, for example, is an extremely controversial figure and had a lot of controversy lately. And when that controversy hit, he came out and he just it was a 5-minute kind of monologue about his thoughts, raw from his brain. And I think that method of communication, interaction with an audience, not just your own audience, but the broader audience, to tell your side of the story and actually get across your feelings, like what is going on. I'm a human, right? I'm having this experience. I think is incredibly important, more so than a well-crafted PR message that comes out 2 weeks later.
Yeah, that's interesting. That's what I'm kind of struggling thinking about now. But other than that, the internal support system is still really important.
Yeah, I don't know. I think like people, it's hard to see people as people, and I think we have to remind each other that we're all people. That's one of the things I come back to. One of the things I wanted to ask you is we played to get together a bunch back in the day, and we played a lot of different champions. Which champion do you think you were better than me at back in 2011, 2012?
Oh, back in 2011, we probably played a different pool, right? Like with full vision going into the past. Like I used to think that if you asked me this 10 years ago, I probably would have said like almost every champion that I played. But now I would say it would be like Udyr, Trundle, and Amumu.
You think you were better than me at Amumu?
I was really good at Amumu. You were an Amumu guy too.
I was a big Amumu guy. I think I will not accept that. I'll take Udyr. I'll take Trundle. I will not take that you were better than me.
I guess a lot of the junglers back then were Amumu. The thing is, I still play him.
Yeah.
Like he's in modern League of Legends, which oftentimes is a mistake. But interesting. Yeah. Okay. Maybe I'll give you Mumu. It's definitely Udyr and Trundle would be the ones because they're like kind of similar in the way they play as well.
Is there a transition? We talked about this a little bit earlier, which is this transition into different career paths and even content verticals. Casting is one thing. You start to do all these kind of series that you mentioned, like this or that, and in different series. Was that something you were internally like, I'm really excited to do this thing? Or was it, I need to stretch different muscles and try different things? Like what was the kind of pull to try these different shows and formats?
Definitely a combination. Those shows definitely couldn't have been made like just because of me. But I would say the original way that this or that came about was they wanted to start a show called like Primetime League, which would be this 30-minute to an hour kind of variety show about different league topics. It actually started kind of as a news show called like LCS pre-show. They didn't even have pre-shows back then, but they had European and North American LCS combined into one like channel. It was on the Riot Games channel. And me and Riv and I would wake up at like 3 a.m. on Thursday so we could do the LCS preview show because the EU LCS was the first LCS that started and we had to do the preview show for it. And Los Angeles was the only studio with the production capabilities to actually do that show. So they needed NA talent for it. But when I was pitched on it, I'm like, oh, no, absolutely. Like, I definitely want to do this, even though as like a color commentator, I wouldn't originally be seen as someone that could be like a host. But I really wanted to develop. At the time, it was a heavily prompter-reliant show. I really wanted to develop prompter skills and then have more variety in what I was able to deliver because I really did want to become a more well-rounded, like, broadcast person. So that was one thing. And then that LCS preview show eventually became Primetime League, and then Primetime League was a bunch of these like smaller shows, and This or That was one that always seemed to really stick. So eventually the decision was made to kind of get rid of PTL but keep the segments that worked. There was more than This or That. This or That just ended up being the most successful one. But I was always like, the reason I loved that show so much is, one, it allowed me to show personality, and two, like, the workload was shared so far away from me. Like, the whole premise of the show is me and Kobe never saw the slides beforehand so we could react. So realistically, this is like a 20-minute time commitment a week for us compared to other like high-quality 6-minute pieces. This is going to take you several hours to make. So that part I really liked because it was like a large production lift, and it worked really synergistically with us. And then for the first podcast, we made the dive. Like, I really, really pushed for the dive. There was definitely significant portion that just thought, like, oh, we've tried podcasts before. Like, long-form podcasts for League don't work. And they're like, well, okay, just, like, let us push this out, and let's see if it catches on. And our first 8 episodes were audio only before we eventually were able to convince people to give us cameras and put it on YouTube. So that was a long answer to your question, but the short answer would be, yeah, pretty much. I wanted to expand.
There's 2 things in that I was really curious to learn more about. One was you mentioned Riv and being in the trenches and getting up at 3 a.m.
Yeah.
Arguably, like, another caster could be your competition or it could be your teammate when you're in this environment. Similarly, even in pro play, there was some, and I think in content creation, the same thing happens where the other streamer that is at the same level as you in the same game is either your competition or could make an incredible peer because you're going through this experience together. How did you balance that? Kind of, you're somewhat competitive, but you're also in this to deliver a great product.
That's a really good question. I want to get your answer on this too. When I've been the most successful, it's been when I treat everything as like a big team. And that's like the saying, a rising tide lifts all boats sort of thing. There's a very small moment when I first became a caster in 2013 where I didn't really want to me, it was this like really arrogant, like young kid thing to think. Cause like, I don't really want to teach these guys how to cast. Like, I know how to cast. Like, I should just be the good caster. But then I just got so much better by being really open with the whole team about my thought process and how I approached the game, because it just allowed me to work so much better with other casters. And it just ended up elevating me. Like, in order to teach something, you have to know it to a higher level than you like actually realize. So back then, I definitely did not see it at all as competition. And it was aided by the systems that were in place at the time. So I think if the ecosystem was the way it was now, I don't know if I would have been able to think the way that I thought. But it was the fact that like everyone was just a salaried employee. It's not like you were getting huge bonuses or, oh, I just didn't get a rate for another month because this guy got it above me. Like, kind of just everyone was getting paid. So why not help everyone else as well as it making you better? So it was super, super good team atmosphere back then.
Hey, I just want to take a little pause from the episode to tell you about an amazing opportunity that we have. Stone's going to share a little more details, but if you're interested in growing your stream, then listen to what he has to say.
Did you know there's a proven way to grow your stream? I get that growing your audience can feel impossible. I've been there, but I'm here to tell you that with the right framework, it's not only possible, I try and make it as simple as possible. I spent the last 10 years learning how to hone my craft, and I've distilled the most important things that I've learned into a 1-hour free live training session. I'm going to be talking about the most important things that you should be focusing on to create amazing content, grow your audience, and to monetize. You shouldn't be working hard and not seeing results. I want to save you from working on the stuff that isn't really moving the needle for you. There's a proven framework that every streamer uses to grow. It might be in different ways, but I'll even show you examples of how it's worked with many new creators. So what's the secret? Stay tuned for the session, find out. Spots are even limited, so make sure to save it now, and I hope to see you there. Just click the link in the episode description to register.
creators that go through such a hard and lonely road, and if you can't share that journey with other people that are going through a similar thing, and lean on peers to go through that, I think it can be extremely lonely because friends and family typically don't get it, and it's a new industry.
Yeah.
So we try and really encourage people find their group that they can go through that journey. And some of the most successful pods in content creation are, if you look at the very top, you might have like Offline TV, PokeValk, like that's a unit. They're sharing their experiences. Or you've got like Lupo and Tim the Tatman and Courage. Like they've got their little pod and they're going through that journey, and it's very much not about it being a zero-sum game.
Yeah, definitely not. They bounce around with each other. I mean, wasn't that like the Among Us thing where like the whole reason that worked is because they were like combining so many of their audiences together, and instead of it being like all of Valkyrie's viewers go to Toast, it's like no, the viewers just watch both because it's interesting.
It creates better content. Like, it's fresh. It's interesting.
Super explosive. Yeah.
Super interesting.
So I guess is that the answer to your question, like in terms of individual versus team, or how do you feel about it?
Yeah, I do very much believe it's not a zero-sum game, and you should look to surround yourself with people that are either at the same level or better than you. It will help you be a better person at the end of the day, and better at your craft. So I do think I would really encourage people to have that uncomfortable conversation and reach out. It's so fascinating because I know some incredibly successful people and creators, and they are so intimidated by the idea of reaching out and being vulnerable and kind of opening up and saying, hey, how are you thinking about this? It's just such a hard kind of thing because there is this weird dynamic online that doesn't exist when we're in person.
Yeah, especially because you can send a message and the person can definitely hear it. And you imagine that online if someone just like, hey, how you doing? Can you answer this question? They just like walk away and never come back. Because like that can happen online. You just get ghosted. So it can be uncomfortable.
It's a lot to put yourself out there. When you were going through the casting, you made the conscious choice to transition out of casting. How did that come about? Did you feel like you had kind of mastered the craft and you wanted to grow again in another area?
I definitely felt like I had stalled out a little bit, and the original decision that I'd made between casting and game design, I felt like the calculus had just changed, because I felt like I looked across to Europe and North America and even some of the English-speaking casters in China and Korea, and I'm like, there's a lot of really good casters now. Like even though I still think I'm really good, I don't think I'm one of one anymore. So maybe I just go do the thing that I wanted to do 7 years ago and just try it out. And it was cool because at Riot, I still did have access to the people on the game design team, and I'd kept not strong relationships, but good enough relationships where I would still check in with them and have conversations with them and provide feedback, and I'd answer questions, and they valued the feedback that I'd give over this like 7-year period. So I'd done a lot of like almost slowly investing throughout the 7 years, like keeping my foot in the door. And yeah, I was able to actually get a job as a mid-level game designer, which I thought like down the road, if I'm thinking 20 years into the future, like this could very easily be a game design career. Getting mid-level game design experience at a company like Riot is going to be extremely valuable, whether I stay at Riot or whether I don't. So I should just go do this thing. This seems like a really good idea. And turns out I just didn't like it as much as I thought I would. So I did that for 8 months and ended up coming back to casting. And what was really interesting to me there was the 8 months not casting and also gaining other experience with game design. In my opinion, when I came back, I was doing the best casting I had of my career. Because part of it is going to be that I had a different, slightly different skill set, and I'd balanced the game for 6 months. But the other part is I just had almost a newfound appreciation for it, and I could just have more fun with it. It was really more clear to me that was what I wanted to do. And I think it really helped.
That's really powerful. So you kind of fallen out of love with casting in the process, and you needed a little bit of away from your long lost love, and then you kind of rekindled that love when you came back.
Yeah, pretty much.
That's really cool. When you made the transition from casting into coaching, that seems like a big departure. Yeah,
that's it. So that's, now I feel like I'm I'm still really mixed feelings on whether or not that was the right call. There's one thing that I think happens way more in traditional sports compared to esports broadcasting, and that's the fluidity between coaches and broadcast, or recent players and broadcast. So you look at the NFL, like Tony Romo just like was a huge shot in the arm for NFL commentary. He was so good. But part of that is because he can still make reads live. He can still read a defense, say what he thinks a quarterback is doing. And there's only like 50 people in the world that can do what Tony Romo does mentally. And then there's like one who can say it with an excited voice, and that's Tony Romo. Peyton Manning should do it, but he probably has enough money and doesn't care right now. So like that helps. And then also I remember from an NBA commentary perspective, like 10 or 15 years ago when Mark Jackson and Jeff Van Gundy were a recent like player coach combo, when they had the TriCast, that was incredible because they both had like, hey, here's a recent coach perspective, here's a recent player perspective, and you're watching this as you're seeing the game. So in terms of coaching, I thought the fallback to casting would still be really strong if things didn't necessarily work out, because I would just have, then I'd be able, my playing experience was very dated. So I still have like a pro player perspective. It's so old. Like at this point, it was almost 9 years old. Recent coaching experience, as well as having some game design experience. Like I would actually be one of one again in terms of all of the different experiences that I would be able to draw from if I still want to broadcast like 5 years down the road. Now, I thought I was going to coach for more than 14 months, but I ended up running into like a bunch of difficulties with that and had, a huge amount of mental and physical stress with it that made me want to leave the job earlier. But that was kind of the thought process going in. And the offer was also just like really, really appealing at the time to join Team Liquid. So there's a lot of things that went into the decision, both thinking like long-term and short-term. But if I was purely following like the thing that I was enjoying doing the most, I would have just stayed casting.
No, it's fantastic. One of the thing is, to me, is interesting because there's so much I think you can learn from your journey as a creator, and all of this, the series that you did throughout your time casting. You mentioned this or that. You mentioned the Primetime League show. Throughout that process and over the years, and maybe even with your own podcast, as you're trying like different formats out today, you're constantly like evaluating: is this hitting? Like, did I try something new? Did I do something different? Like, the process of coming up with a series is a big investment. And then the decision to go, we got to cut this and go somewhere else. You've been in this process of creating content effectively for a long time. How have you evolved your thinking around cutting something?
That's a good question. I really didn't want to continue with Primetime League. I actually left that show before they ended up stopping to produce the show. Maybe you could say that I kind of like saw the, writing on the wall or something, but the amount of effort it took to create that 30 minutes of content versus the output that we were getting. Like if you're going to put that much effort into a 30-minute piece of content, you need the output to be like, at least at the time, because I was feeling pretty burned out, like really outstanding. And it definitely felt like an episode would release and maybe it was still getting like decent viewership, but the reaction was just muted. Like I would see no, and this is again, like using Reddit and Twitter to inform, but there was like no Reddit traction. There's no Twitter traction on the show. And I thought like, I need to go spend my time doing other things because I'm putting so much time into this that isn't like prepping for casting or being a better caster. So I should change. And then like with my podcast now that I'm pretty excited about, JLXP, that I did back in 2020, stopped when I joined Team Liquid, and now it's back. But instead of it being like a me and Riot collab, like it's just my show now, it is, I'm definitely trying to hit like a pocket of League viewers who want like more thoughtful, measured commentary, still long form, but not as long form as other League podcasts are. There's a lot of League podcasts. All of them are like 1.3 to 3 hours. So I'm like, if I have a guest, it'll probably be 40 minutes. If it's just me, I'm going to do a 20-minute hit that is just almost a data dump of what my thoughts are. And it's not going to be super toxic. I'm not going to flame people. I'm not going to say everyone sucks right? I'm going to talk about the reasons that things can and cannot work and what I think is happening. And I really do think there's a pocket there. So if I no longer feel like there's a pocket there, I'm going to pivot. But that's a spot that I think is worth exploring.
I'm so excited. I love your pod. I think it's such a exciting chapter for you to lean back into the podcast again. I think there's so much potential there. As you're looking out, kind of going forward in the future with the podcast, and now you're in the freelance capacity, you're kind of building the Jatt brand or the Josh Leesman brand. You're building that. When you think about what's next, what's 2022? What do you want to accomplish? What are you looking at this year?
Yeah, it is a combination. I want to be like accepted enough that I can work some international events again. So I'd like to be brought on for MSI and Worlds. And with that, I want to make frequent content, podcast content on both MSI and Worlds, because those are huge viewership spikes for League. It's just massive impressions. There's a better word for that, but there's just massive engagement around Worlds. Like I think the audience like triples or quadruples at this point. And it's actually really cool with League, because I feel like this is how like Americans watch the World Cup, is kind of what League and the World Championship is becoming. Like most Americans just don't watch soccer, but the World Cup comes on, they're sure as hell going to watch it. And I think if you have ever watched League in North America or Europe, or like as an English speaker, you probably aren't even watching regular season anymore. There's still a dedicated audience that does, but everyone's going to watch Worlds. So like the audience is just so much more massive around Worlds. So getting the cross-pollination of being a part of Worlds while also then being able to point people towards my content, I want to see how much I can grow. If it hasn't grown and I'm not enjoying doing it, I'd obviously pivot. But that's kind of the exposure will point to the podcast, hopefully. And hopefully the content continues to be like dynamic and interesting for me to make. And I'm going to see how much it's grown by the end of the year.
Jatt, this was absolutely phenomenal. I'm so happy to get you on. It was honestly a real privilege and honor for me. I've followed your journey over the years, in the trenches in the beginning, and then more from afar in recent years. But stoked to see you again. Thanks for coming on the pod.
Yeah, good to see you, man. Thanks.
Cheers, Josh. Thank you so much for tuning in to today's episode. I wanted to just end this with a little bit of context on why we do what we do. We're former content creators ourselves, and we just really want to help as many content creators as we can. That's why we started Pipeline.gg. It's a platform where you can find other like-minded creators and learn from the pros who have already been there. Get step-by-step guidance so you can avoid all the mistakes that we made in the beginning. If you love the episode, there's going to be even more insight on Pipeline. So check it out. Head over to Pipeline.gg.